Montreal, October 1970. It is over 400 years since the French first came to Quebec. It is over 200 years since the English defeated the French here on the Heights of Abraham in Quebec City. It is over 100 years since Canada became a nation which encompasses Quebec. But Quebec's French-speaking population has persistently survived as a living Francophone culture, never forgetting that one day Quebec might become a separate French-speaking state, free of outside domination. And nothing in Quebec has been more persistent than the entrenched Catholic Church. Warding off assimilation while working with the English, the Church supported Quebec politicians such as Premier Duplessis. Duplessis was an authoritarian, a defender of the status quo, a Quebec nationalist, and a determined friend of private industry, who sold Quebec's natural resources to outside interests. Business flourished in English. Francophone Quebec remained rural, subjugated, and poor. But in the 40s and 50s, abused Quebec workers began to demand the basic right to strike. They were joined by intellectuals such as Pierre Elliott Trudeau, seen here in Bermuda shorts, and by organizers such as Michel Chartrand, ranged firmly against the miners, with the powers which controlled and exploited Quebec. Industrialization had come abruptly during World War II, and now it was sudden unionization. Here at Murdochville, the marching protesters were attacked from the hillsides by scabs hired to intimidate them. These early struggles aroused widespread sympathy throughout Quebec, and in English Canada, which had witnessed similar bloody clashes in the 1920s. Here was the beginning of real social upheaval. The people of Quebec saw that change was within their grasp. Duplessis died in 1959, undermining the established powers and opening the way for la révolution tranquille. Under liberal Lesage, an enthusiastic Quebec burst forward to become part of contemporary North America. 20th century progress moved out quickly from behind the traditional powers as education, industry, science, the arts, and the whole social climate in Quebec quickened, shaking off the cobwebs of centuries of isolation. Prompted by a certain René Lévesque, the provincial Liberals decided that it was time Quebec's resources be controlled by Quebec. The nationalization of electricity is the key issue in Lesage's second election. He wins easily, and the state-run Hydro-Quebec comes to life. At the same time, the Canadian nation comes under fire. The federal government spending of Quebec's tax revenue, the imposition of the Queen's name on a government hotel in Montreal, and the federal presence in Quebec communications are all attacked, setting off the present wave of separatism. French is the language of over 80% of Quebec's population, and the separatists want Quebec to become an independent French-speaking nation. They feel that even written in French, English controls the money, the power, and the force. The Mounties are the federal government's police. They too are seen as evidence that Quebec is controlled from outside. The separatists are led by people like Barbeau, Dalmain, and Pierre Bourgault. Opposing the separatists is a group of Quebec federalists who have also fought hard and long for Quebec. Pierre Elliott Trudeau and his confrères believe in a strong and progressive Quebec within the Canadian Confederation. They worked alongside the separatists in the struggle against Duplessis, but now their activities and their writings spark a crucial battle with the separatists, which continues today. The president of the Canadian National Railways announced that there were not enough French Canadians qualified for senior management positions. Gordon's statement enraged a Francophone population, which for centuries had seen the best jobs always go to the English. The demonstrators served notice on Canada that Quebec will no longer put up with discrimination. In 1963, extremists turned to violence, marking the birth of Le Front de Libération du Québec, the FLQ. The terrorists choose where Wolfe had thought himself victorious. Sometimes the FLQ's bombs were discovered and defused in time. But when this young man placed a bomb in a garbage can, in this alley, behind this army recruiting building, an old man called Wilfred O'Neill was blown up. O'Neill was given a military funeral, but none of the politicians came. The National Revenue Building, the RCMP headquarters, the Canadian National Railways, the Black Watch Armory, the Royal Canadian Air Force, the Queen Victoria Monument, La Grenade Shoe Factory, the Paul Sauvé Arena, Dominion Textiles, Standard Structural Steel, Eaton's, Murray Hill, Chambre de Transport, the Montreal City Hall, the Bank of Nova Scotia, the Quebec Ministry of Labour, the Canadian Army, the Montreal Stock Exchange, the Queen's Printers, the Chateau Frontenac, the Industrial Acceptance Corporation, Mayor Drapeau's residence, Loyola College, McGill University, the Bank of Montreal, and many others were bombed. In 7 years, 6 people were killed. But Walter Leja survived a direct blast while trying to defuse a bomb in a mailbox in Westmount. In 1964, the Queen came to Canada. She was welcomed by English Canadians as part of their heritage. But to many French Canadians, she came as a symbol of British domination. At a meeting of the separatist RIN party, the newly elected president, Pierre Bourgault, denounced her presence in Quebec. Reminded once again that in Canada the rights and traditions of the English are better protected than those of the French, the angry crowd took to the streets ready for anything. But it was not until the next morning that the protest hotted up. The separatists squared off against the police in what was to be known as Le Samedi de la Matraque, the Saturday of the Truncheon. The Law and Order Minister of Justice for the Liberal Party, Claude Wagner, denied that there had been any police brutality.
Et nous n'avons pas vu de victimes.
The next year, the Commission for Bilingualism and Biculturalism stated that Canada was going through the gravest crisis in its history without even knowing it.
I'm completely convinced that separatism will vanish. If it is not understood in time, well, I don't know exactly what is going to happen.
But Prime Minister Pearson had known for a long time that separatism was a crisis, and one of his moves to hold Canada together was to persuade 3 of Quebec's most influential social leaders to join him in the Federal Liberal Party.
It seems to me important that all those who are capable of doing so in French Canada should work towards a solution to this problem and also ensure a new Quebec presence in Ottawa.
First of all, the Liberal Party, by reforming its structures and by beginning to democratize itself, has made itself acceptable. But above all, it is the only major political party at the present time which has expressed the desire and which has the means to find solutions to the problems which concern me most, and to find these solutions within realistic time limits rather than those of personal choice.
Je suis venu à la conclusion personnellement que
And I personally have reached the conclusion that this particular party is receptive to the type of ideas which I wish to put forward. I also felt that the type of activity I wish to engage in would be possible.
At the other extreme were the separatists, Charles Gagnon and Pierre Valliere, the two leading FLQ polemicists. Sought by the Canadian police, they demonstrated outside the United Nations in New York, taking their cause to the world. They are quickly arrested by the Americans, and then illegally returned to Canada. It will be over 3 years before they will be released on bail. In 1966, the separatist RAN party fields a slate under In 1966, the separatist RAN party fields a slate under Pierre Bourgault. Unexpectedly, the conservative vote puts an end to La Révolution Tranquille by re-electing Duplessis' old party, the Union Nationale, now led by Daniel Johnson. The separatists get 10% of the vote. The following year, Quebec is the star of Canada's centennial, but some of the guests prove difficult. Charles de Gaulle, unlike the Queen, is enthusiastically welcomed by the Quebecois, but he antagonizes Canada by confusing his trip through Quebec with the liberation of France. He shortens his visit by encouraging separatism from the balcony of the Montreal City Hall.
Et je puis vous dire qu'elle en vaudra mieux. Vive Montréal, vive le Québec. Vive le Québec libre.
The General may have his own opinions on the Canadian Confederation, but the problem of the Constitution and of Canada will be resolved here in Canada.
But in Canada, separatism is quickly becoming a respectable political movement. It spreads to the Quebec House of Commons, where a key member of the Provincial Liberal Party, René Lévesque, publishes a manifesto demanding special rights for Quebec. This causes consternation amongst his fellow Liberals, such as Eric Kierans. Although hopes that the breach between the Liberals and Lévesque can be mended are expressed by Robert Bourassa.
I was a bit encouraged this afternoon. I think the atmosphere was much better this afternoon.
Lévesque is dropped by the Liberals, and he forms his own independentist movement. But the next election is a federal election. Trudeau takes over as Prime Minister. Trudeau's platform is national unity, an end to separatism.
Some people, I think, are afraid of the word confrontation. They think you can get more by giving in to extremists. I don't believe that.
On the eve of the '68 election, Trudeau goes to participate in Quebec's Saint-Jean-Baptiste celebrations. Pierre Bourgault and many of the other separatists there felt that Trudeau was a traitor to Quebec. Soon, bottles aimed at Trudeau begin to fly, hitting spectators in the crowd. The protesters' aim improves, and the police charge blindly into the crowd. Watched on television by millions of voters, Trudeau angrily refuses to be chased away by the separatists. The police and the protesters battle below him, while the parade goes on, oblivious. Canadians from coast to coast are saddened by the spectacle of Quebecois fighting Quebecois. And the next day, supported by both French and English, Trudeau will win the election easily on a wave of Trudeau mania. English Canada makes it clear that they expect Trudeau to snuff out the separatists. But Levesque and Bourgault join forces, and the turbulent RAN disappears forever into the newer, bigger, more moderate separatist party, the Parti Québécois. As a Liberal minister, Levesque had shown that he could run Quebec. Now a separatist and a socialist, he is elected leader of the new party, and for the first time, the separatists become a credible alternative to the traditional parties. And things are moving on the union front, where more and more separatism and union strife are becoming interrelated. Montreal taxi drivers go out on strike, protesting against poor pay, insecurity, and the Anglophone Murray Hill monopoly over the lucrative hotel and airport taxi trade. Some of the drivers blockade the streets, and they are arrested. But soon the police themselves are on strike. During the day, the abandoned streets of Montreal are peaceful, while the police meet at the Paul Sauvé Arena. Like many other Quebec workers, the policeman's goal is income parity with English-speaking Ontario, and Mayor Drapeau and his administrator Lucien Saunier are cast as the villains. That evening, the unprotected city erupts into violence and looting. Old wounds are avenged, and Mayor Drapeau's expensive restaurant, Le Vaisseau d'Or, is sacked. While a nervous Montreal stays behind closed doors, the workers and the capitalists clash head-on. Striking taxi drivers and some extremist sympathizers attack the Murray Hill garages. The property is defended by armed guards. Several people are injured, and a plainclothes policeman is killed, mysteriously shot in the back. Two members of the FLQ, Marc Carbonneau and Jacques Lanctot, are wounded in the attack. It will not be the last time these two have something to do with the Canadian Army being called in to protect Montreal. Next, it is the postal workers protesting the federal government's treatment of the La Palme drivers. The La Palme drivers themselves stay on in Ottawa, a constant reminder to the House of Commons that all is not well with the workers of Quebec. And then there is the other great question, the survival of the French language and culture in Quebec. This issue draws support from many people who are not separatists. There are the huge Saint-Léonard and Bill 63 demonstrations. The French Canadians insist that if immigrants are allowed to speak English, the French language and culture will vanish into the ocean of English-speaking North America. The immigrants insist on having the right to choose their own language. In this crowd is another member of the FLQ, Paul Rose. And then Robert Shaw, a McGill University administrator, finds himself facing the McGill Francais movement, which includes a number of Anglophones.
4 or 5 of those.
But many who are not revolutionaries sympathize, because the rights of the English minority in Quebec have always been far better protected than those of the French elsewhere in Canada. And justice for the French majority has not always been sure, as Valliere and Gagnon know only too well when they are finally let out on bail. Gagnon states through his interpreter, lawyer Robert Lemieux, that he will continue to work for
the realization of the independence of the people of Quebec,
as are many of the artists and performers of Quebec. 1870, a crucial provincial election. Cardinal divides the incumbent right-wing Union Nationale, now under the shaky Bertrand. For the first time, the separatists have a chance to take power, so the federal Liberals nervously throw their weight behind their provincial counterparts. Pierre Laporte and the other two Liberal leadership contenders believe that Quebec should stay within the Canadian Confederation. Laporte, the most experienced politician in the race, insists that independence would mean economic disaster. Laporte does well, but the former Law and Order Minister of Justice, Claude Wagner, does better, and the young technocrat, Robert Bourassa, does best of all. Wagner resigns from the Liberal Party, but Pierre Laporte agrees to stay on as Bourassa's right-hand man. The Federalist Créditistes enter the provincial election for the first time. The Separatist Party Québécois, with the convincing Lévesque, is there for the first time too.
And I'd like to say we've got no lesson.
Bertrand tries to hold back the waves of change, but the Parti Québécois on the left and the Créditistes on the extreme right cut into his supporters from both sides, and the Union Nationale goes down before the well-organized Liberals, who take power easily with their slogan of Quebec back to work. The Parti Québécois does well, although much less well than feared by English Canada. They win 24% of the vote, but this gives them only 6% of the seats. Lévesque himself loses his seat, but 7 others become the first members of Parliament elected as separatists.
Dear friends, don't forget that this is a defeat which feels like a victory.
Many Québécois felt that the Parti Québécois had been cheated, and that somehow the democratic process no longer worked in Quebec. In June, the Ministry of Defense was bombed, and other acts of retaliation were expected from the violent extremists, the FLQ. But nothing major happened until Monday, October the 5th.
The senior British Trade Commissioner in Montreal, James Richard Cross, is reported to have been kidnapped a short while ago from his Redpath Crescent home by as many as 4 armed men believed to be FLQ terrorists. First reports indicate the men arrived at the home in a taxi and said they had a birthday gift for Mr. Cross. When the maid refused to allow them into the house, they unwrapped the gift, which turned out to be a machine gun, and forced their way into the home. Mr. Cross was forced at gunpoint to enter the waiting taxi and had sped away from the scene. An intensive police search is underway for the kidnapped victim and his abductors.
We have received a communique from those who have kidnapped Mr. Cross, the commercial representative of the United Kingdom government, putting the authorities en demeure, asking them to comply with a certain number of demands within 48 hours, which are to refrain from any police action, to publish in its entirety a manifesto from the FLQ movement, to free a certain number of alleged political prisoners, and to put these political prisoners on a plane on its way to Cuba or Algeria.
Clearly, these are wholly unreasonable demands, and their authors could not have expected them to be accepted. I need hardly say that this set of demands will not be met.
The government and the Liberation Cell of the FLQ bargain on prime time in a deadly media debate for the life of James Richard Cross. A flow of communiques from the kidnappers is answered with a spate of televised appeals by the authorities.
It is the case of an innocent individual who bears no responsibility whatsoever for our internal problems and who is held as hostage. It is the gravest form of blackmail which exists.
It's a stalemate. Deadline after deadline passes.
The governments are ready to explore all practical avenues out of this impasse.
Proof is given that Cross is still alive.
I urgently appeal to those who hold Mr. Cross that they allow their respect for human life to overcome their political aspirations, misdirected as they may be. They should realize that this manner of defending their cause can only bring about its eventual defeat.
The FLQ specify the man they want to negotiate for them. Lawyer Robert Lemieux.
I suggest to you that the federal government is saying we want to negotiate, but it doesn't really want to do that. It just wants to buy time to have a shootout match with the FLQ at best and hope that they can have them surrender. And if that is not the case, we'll see from now until 12 o'clock what Mr. Sharp's position will be.
The FLQ drops a number of its demands. In its turn, the government agrees to make public the FLQ manifesto. This manifesto sets out the FLQ's position. It is the only explanation given for what happened. To the surprise of the authorities, it was very sympathetically received by the people of Quebec, who agreed with many of its eloquent aims and angers. For these reasons, it is a key to the crisis.
Front de Libération du Québec, manifeste.
The FLQ Manifesto. The Front de Libération du Québec is not the Messiah, nor a modern-day Robin Hood. It is a regrouping of Quebec workers who have decided to use every means at their disposal to ensure that the people of Quebec assume control of their own destiny. The Front de Libération du Québec wants complete independence for all Quebecers, united in a free society, purged forever of its clique of voracious sharks, the patronizing big bosses and their henchmen who have made Quebec their private preserve for cheap labor and unscrupulous exploitation. The Front de Libération du Québec is not a movement of aggression, but a movement countering the aggression organized by high finance and the puppet governments in Ottawa and Quebec. The Brink Show, Bill 63, the electoral map, the so-called social progress tax, Power Corporation, health insurance, the La Palme Boys. The Front de Libération du Québec finances itself through voluntary taxes, levied from the very enterprises which exploit the workers, banks, finance companies, etc. A quote from René Lévesque, April 29, 1970. Those wielding the money in the status quo, most of whom constitute the traditional tutors of our people, obtained the reaction they were looking for, a step back, rather than the change for which we had worked as never before, and for which we shall continue to work. End of quote. At one time, we believed it would be to our advantage to channel our energies and our impatience, as René Lévesque put it so aptly, into the Parti Québécois. But the Liberal victory was a clear indication that what is called democracy here in Quebec has always been and still is the democracy of the rich. The Liberal victory was nothing more than the victory of the election riggers, the Simard-Cotroni gang. As a result, we are through with the British parliamentary system. The Front de Libération du Québec will no longer allow itself to be duped by the electoral crumbs which are disdainfully scattered in Quebec every 4 years by the Anglo-Saxon capitalists. A number of Quebecers have come to understand this and are ready to take action. In the coming year, Bourassa will have a rude awakening. 100,000 revolutionary workers organized and armed. Yes, there are reasons for the Liberal victory. We live in a society of terrorized slaves, terrorized by the big bosses such as Steinberg, Clark, Bronfman, Smith, Nipol, Timmins, Geoffrion, J.L. Lévesque, Hirshhorn, Thompson, Nesbitt, Desmarais, and Kierans. Compared to this league, Rémy Popol, the whipping boy, Drapeau the dog, Bourassa, the Simard sidekick, and Trudeau the queer are mere peanuts. We are terrorized by the capitalistic Roman Catholic Church, even though this is becoming less noticeable. Who owns the stock exchange building? By the payments which must be made to household finance, by the publicity of the great consumer overlords, such as Eaton's, Simpson's, Morgan's, Steinberg's, and General Motors. Terrorized by the closed circles of science and culture which make up our universities, and by their oppressive directors, Gaudry and Doré, and Robert Shaw, their underling. There are a growing number of us who are aware of this society and of being subjected to its terrorist tactics, and the day will come when the Westmounts of Quebec will be wiped off the map. Workers in production, mines, forests, service industries, teachers, students, and unemployed workers, take what belongs to you, your jobs, your right to decide, and your freedom. And you, the workers at General Electric, you are the people who run the factory. You alone are the producers. Without you, there is no General Electric. Workers of Quebec, start today to recover what belongs to you, what is rightfully yours. You alone know your factories, your machines, your hotels, your universities, your unions. Don't wait for some kind of miracle organization. Start your revolution in your own neighborhoods, in your places of work. If you don't, usurping technocrats and others will replace the handful of cigar-puffing taskmasters, and everything will be as before. You alone can build a free society. We must fight, not as individuals, but as a group. We must fight until we achieve victory with all the means at our disposal, as did the patriots of 1837-38, the very ones whom our Sacred Mother, the Church, couldn't wait to excommunicate, to better sell out to British interests. May all those throughout Quebec who have been contemptuously referred to as the lousy French and the alcoholics join ranks and fight against the enemies of justice and liberty, and stop the professional thieves and gangsters, the bankers, businessmen, judges, and corrupt politicians. We are the workers of Quebec, and we will fight to the bitter end. With the help of the people, we will replace the present enslaved society with a free and open society, functioning by and for itself. Our struggle can only be victorious. An emerging nation cannot be kept indefinitely in misery and contempt. Long live free Quebec, long live our comrades held as political prisoners, long live the Quebec Revolution, long live the FLQ. For humanitarian reasons, which need not be gone into, given the events of the past few days, we have read the FLQ Manifesto in the hope of saving the life of the Senior British Trade Commissioner, Mr. James Richard Cross.
But Cross remains in the hands of the elusive FLQ. On Saturday, October the 10th, the Provincial Minister of Justice, Jérôme Choquette, makes it clear that broadcasting the FLQ Manifesto was one of the government's very last concessions.
No society can accept that the decisions of its government and of its courts of law can be questioned or can be erased by the use of blackmail exercised by a group, because this signifies the end of all social order. As an ultimate concession to save the life of Mr. Cross, the federal government has instructed me that it is disposed to offer you safe conduct towards a foreign country.
Choquette is heard by a new cell, and a few minutes later, while playing touch football here outside his house, Pierre Laporte, the Minister of Labour and Immigration, is kidnapped by the FLQ. For Laporte's mother, for his wife and family, no amount of relatives, friends, well-wishers, or police roadblocks can hide the fact that Laporte and his abductors cannot be found. Overnight, the FLQ is taken very seriously. Under tight security, Robert Bourassa, the young and inexperienced premier, moves his government to Montreal. Stories of hundreds of armed FLQ terrorists fighting in the streets, systematic kidnappings, and impending selective assassinations grow wildly as the country holds its breath, waiting to hear what has happened to Pierre Laporte. Then communiques from the new Chenier cell start pouring into CKAC, each angrily insisting on all of the original 7 FLQ demands. No one knows if the two cells are connected in any way, and the man who had earlier taken a hard line against the Cross kidnappers, Pierre Laporte, now pleads for his life in a tragic letter to Robert Bourassa. But the government has rejected emotional decision. 2 days after Trudeau's Just Watch Me, Thursday, October the 15th. Paul Sauvé Arena is filled to overflowing with angry Quebecois who put on an impressive display of separatist solidarity. English Canada is scared by the passionate build-up of support for the aims of the FLQ manifesto.
Les gars du front nous ont peut-être un petit peu fait comprendre ça.
Maybe the guys of the FLQ have succeeded in making us understand to a certain extent. We are going to organize ourselves intelligently, we're going to choose our own positions, and we shall overcome.
Nous vaincrons!
But the Canadian Army is already moving into Quebec. The Montreal and Quebec governments formally request that Ottawa take urgent action. At 4 a.m. that morning, Trudeau's government invokes the War Measures Act, claiming that there is a state of apprehended insurrection in Quebec. Unaware that the law of the land had changed while they were sleeping, hundreds of astonished and outraged people find themselves abruptly taken from their homes in the dead of night and imprisoned. These people are to discover that under the War Measures Act, they can be kept incommunicado, that they will not be able to be bailed out immediately, that they can be kept in prison for up to 90 days without a trial, and that being a member of the FLQ has suddenly and retroactively become a crime, punishable by up to 5 years in prison. Bourassa explains why he made his request to Ottawa.
Well, just yesterday you called in the Canadian Army. Again, you said at Quebec's request that it came to Quebec. Was that not enough to protect our democratic institutions, as you mentioned in the National Assembly?
They were the police action in order to find ways and in order to find Mr. Laporte and Mr. Cross. Obviously, they need some additional powers to be efficient. So the army was called to protect the population because there were a lot of public buildings which were unprotected and which need protection, but they were also the efficiency of the police action, and this was the reason why we decided to ask the federal government to pass these, to give these additional powers.
How bad is the situation? If I can quote from your communique here, you mention renverser le gouvernement, overthrow the government. Was it that far advanced?
It was well known that there was a plan about a small group of people, but even if this group
How small
was,
a group?
perhaps a few hundred people, but they were strong enough to create a lot of trouble. They started with violent meetings. After that, they had recourse to bombs, and now to kidnappings. So we have to stop that, because where it will finish. So it's not a question of limiting the civil liberties of the people. It's a question of staying in a democratic system. The total population, the almost total population in Quebec and in Canada are for a democratic system. So we have to defend that will of the people.
You mentioned 3 points, and earlier today your Minister of Finance mentioned 4 points: demonstrations, bombing, kidnappings, and selective assassination.
Yes.
Are you satisfied that these terrorists were prepared to go that far?
We have no clear indication that they were prepared to go that far, but obviously, clearly, we have no choice but to take no risk. They accomplished the first 3 steps. Why we should take risk that they will kill people? So our clear duty was to stop that. And it was our obvious responsibility, and we assumed that responsibility.
You spoke of a threat to democratic institutions again yesterday. Is it not possible that many people in this country will feel that the government itself has now carried out a threat to democracy and limiting civil rights so severely?
But it's not a question of limiting civil rights on a permanent basis. It's only a question of limited and part civil rights in order to protect the system, in order to protect the regime. This is exactly what we are doing. There is limits for tolerance. When excessive tolerance is endangering, is creating a serious danger for our democratic system.
Thousands of soldiers, many of them unilingual English, cover Quebec. Elsewhere in Canada, Everyone chooses their position, most for, some against, the government's drastic action. The Premier of Ontario, John Robarts, had announced that Canada was in a state of total war. Certainly Canadians were unaccustomed to having soldiers patrolling their streets. But the biggest peacetime intervention of the Army in Canada's history only forced the incredulous and depressed Quebec population to ask themselves once again, what would Ottawa do if Quebec ever did vote for independence? The Army did allow the police to get on with their desperate search for Cross and Laporte. Search warrants are no longer required, so all over Quebec, houses are broken into and searched, and possible clues or evidence are indiscriminately carted away. Uninformed, the opposition parties react as best they can.
But now we have Tommy Douglas.
Mr. Douglas, you described this as Black Friday. Would you care to elaborate?
Well, I think it is Black Friday when government, for the first time in history, invokes the War Measures Act in peacetime and says that there's an apprehended state of insurrection and deprives a great many people of their freedom and their liberty. This means that right now the police at any time can pick up any person who in their opinion is a member of an organization that is subversive and illegal. They can hold them for 90 days without bringing them to trial, without giving them any chance to prove their innocence. At the end of 90 days, they have the right to appeal to a Superior Court judge who then sets the date for their trial.
Because what would you suggest that the government do?
Prepared to give them extensive powers. Don't quarrel with that at all. But surely those powers should be granted by Parliament in a free country and not seized by the government under the pretext that we're faced with an insurrection.
But in your view, the government has not justified a state of what is it, a state of insurrection?
They claim it's a state of apprehended insurrection. Now, these acts of sabotage by the FLQ have been going on for 6 or 7 years. And if the government needed more power, they could have asked for amendments to the criminal code any time in the 3 years that Mr. Trudeau was Minister of Justice or in the 2 years that he'd been Prime Minister. We would have granted such powers if the government could show us that the powers they have are not adequate and that the situation is such that it justifies additional powers. But they haven't come near Parliament for these powers. They've taken these powers unto themselves. And no Prime Minister and no cabinet in the history of Canada has had the wide sweeping powers in peacetime that this cabinet now has.
Yes, Mr. Diefenbaker, the former Prime Minister. Mr. Diefenbaker, has the government convinced you of the need for these measures?
After listening to the Prime Minister, I'm convinced that the government is simply not facing realities. That for over a year, it has known of these thugs. It's kept them either on the Radio Canada or Chartrand has been around. He wasn't found until 4 o'clock this morning. Strange thing that these people who have been preaching revolution, and the government has known of it, are suddenly picked up when they could have been picked up a year ago on charges of sedition and convicted on the basis of the statements they were making.
Are you saying then you're satisfied that they have in fact been picked up now?
Well, I've been told they are, and I believe anyone who said...
Would you approve that? You would approve that?
Oh, absolutely. They should have done it a year ago, and they wouldn't have had this revolutionary situation that permitted the kidnapping of these 2 innocent men. But it's a government that refused to act. I asked over and over again of the Prime Minister and the Minister of Regional Affairs about these Americans coming into Canada, preaching revolution, bloodshed, revolution. And the answer given me was, that's freedom of speech. As long as they speak to selected groups, if they don't make it too public. Well, they found the opportunity to make it very public by using TV media across the country. They preached their doctrine of revolution. And what's happening now is we have the fruit of the family tree of the present government and its predecessor that adopted an attitude of permissiveness to obvious crime.
It is still Friday, October the 16th, and the atmosphere in Quebec is far from permissive as the arrests mount into the hundreds and the searches into the thousands. The soldiers police and the police search. Canada waits to hear why the War Measures Act has been invoked for the first time in peacetime, and why the Canadian Bill of Rights is suspended. That evening, Canadians from coast to coast listen while the actions of his government are explained on national television by Prime Minister Trudeau.
Let me turn now to the broader implications of the threat represented by the FLQ and similar organizations. If a democratic society is to continue to exist, it must be able to root out the cancer of an armed revolutionary movement that is bent on destroying the very basis of our freedoms. For that reason, the government, following an analysis of the facts, including the requests of the government of Quebec and of the City of Montreal for urgent action, decided to proclaim the War Measures Act. It did so at 4 a.m. this morning in order to permit the full weight of government to be brought quickly to bear on all those persons advocating or practicing violence as a means of achieving political ends. At the moment, the FLQ is holding hostage 2 men in the Montreal area, one a British diplomat, the other a Quebec cabinet minister. They are threatened with murder. Should the governments give in to this crude blackmail, we would be facing the breakdown of the legal system and its replacement by the law of the jungle. The government's decision to prevent this from happening is not taken just to defend an important principle. It is taken to protect the lives of Canadians from dangers of the sort I have mentioned. Freedom and personal security are safeguarded by laws. Those laws must be respected in order to be effective. The criminal law as it stands is simply not adequate to deal with systematic terrorism. The police have therefore been given certain extraordinary powers necessary for the effective detection and elimination of conspiratorial organizations which advocate the use of violence. These organizations and membership in them have been declared illegal. The powers include the right to search and arrest without warrant, to detain suspected persons without the necessity of laying specific charges immediately, and to detain persons without bail. These are strong powers, and I find them as distasteful as I am sure you do.
Let me say at the outset that I am as repelled by the activities of these terrorists as any other Canadian. In a society such as ours, terrorism is an ugly and unnecessary cancer that we must do everything to eliminate. Everything, that is, except change the very nature of our free society that we are trying, in fact, to protect. In the process of defending freedom, we must not destroy it. In the process of protecting democracy, we must reduce to a necessary minimum any departure from democratic procedures. I want to make it clear that action is necessary and that the government must have the necessary power to deal with this small group of ruthless men.
The information we do have showed a situation of criminal acts and criminal conspiracy in Quebec, but there is no information that there was unintended or apprehended or planned insurrection, which alone could justify invoking the War Measures Act.
The next day, Saturday, October the 17th, with over 300 people already in prison, organized public reaction gets underway in Quebec. The civil rights groups defy the War Measures Act and meet at the University of Montreal. They condemn the government's action. And all over Quebec, students meet to protest and to organize walkouts. The University of Quebec closes down, followed by most of the other universities in the province. While some French Canadians hide from the police, the government suggests that a number of prominent English Canadians leave Quebec for their own safety. But most people nervously lie low at home and follow the events as best they can on radio and television. That afternoon, Saturday, October the 17th, the government has agreed to fly the kidnappers to Cuba should they give themselves up. An aeroplane waits on the tarmac at Dorval. But it is too late. That evening, the airways are filled with stories of death,
A few moments ago, we received confirmation that the bodies of Mr. Laporte and Mr. Cross have been discovered. The newsroom at Telemedia is trying to obtain more information which will be passed on to you in a few minutes.
Is there any mention of Cross? It's not confirmed. Okay. Network music.
L'émission spéciale de Télémédia, voici Normand Maltais.
We should like to remind listeners once again that 11:10 p.m. exactly, close to St. Hubert Airport, that the car which was used 1 week ago to kidnap Pierre Laporte in front of his home on Robitaille Street at St. Lambert was formally identified. The Quebec police force is on its way to Rawdon, where the body of Mr. James Richard Cross is said to have been discovered. He is the second hostage who was kidnapped a little over 2 weeks ago. Mr. Cross is the senior British Trade Commissioner. Several Montreal radio stations have already announced the death of Mr. Cross, but no official police confirmation has been received yet. At exactly 12:25, or rather at 0:25, or 25 minutes after midnight, the trunk of the car was finally opened and the body of Mr. Laporte was discovered, covered in blood. CKAC, Telemedia, first with the news. We'll be back in a few moments. Norman Maltais, Telemedia, Montreal.
Laporte's body is in this car, found by 2 journalists, one of whom was Claude Lachance.
And then we called the police, who took about half an hour to get here.
Did you expect to discover the body?
Yes. Yes, because knowing the FLQ, they never lied in their communiques. Finding the car with the license number which they had indicated, it was 90% sure that there was something in it, and it had to be the body of Laporte. We didn't expect to find any dynamite. I was about 100 feet from the car, 75 feet from the car, because the police wouldn't let us come near, especially as there could have been dynamite. We didn't know what was in the trunk. All the police told us was that there was something very heavy in the trunk of the car. And they opened it, and the policeman who opened the trunk, he was from the bomb disposal unit. And they opened the trunk, and they said that there was indeed a man in the trunk. We tried to get closer, but the police wouldn't let us. All we could see was some white clothes with bloodstains on them. And then, a few minutes later, the men from the identification squad arrived, and they removed the clothes, and we recognized the body of Laporte. I saw him because when he was taken out of the trunk, I caught a glimpse of his body very, very briefly. He was wearing a sweater, a small sweater, pushed to here. His wrists were wrapped in blood-stained towels. I couldn't see his face, but they told me that his cheeks were very swollen and that he had blood on his nostrils here, on the nose and the mouth. The communique said, I can almost quote it, faced with the arrogance of the federal government and of its lackey Bourassa, the FLQ decided to take action. Mr. Pierre Laporte, Minister of Unemployment and Assimilation, was assassinated this evening at 18 minutes past 6 by the Dieppe cell, and in brackets, the 22nd Regiment. You will find the body in the trunk of a green Chevrolet, bearing license number 9J2420. The Front de Libération du Québec, we shall overcome. And there was some indication of where the car was parked, a sort of little sketch of the surrounding area. And a bit lower it was written, warning to all the capitalists in Quebec. And how does it go exactly? Let everyone be on his guard, or something like that. I forget the last sentence, but it goes something like this. And from now on, this is the way things are going to be. Now, this very evening, it is clear that the silent revolution is dead. I have the impression that the real revolution is beginning, that some sort of civil war is stirring in Quebec, and that something extremely serious just happened. A lot of stupid things are going to happen from now on. People will perhaps be tempted to kill indiscriminately.
Et je souhaite au peuple canadien de rester uni dans cette épreuve.
Et maintenant en anglais, s'il vous plaît.
Well, it's with shock and consternation, I believe, that all Canadians have learnt of the death of Mr. Pierre Laporte, who was so cowardly assassinated by a band of murderers. And I can't help feeling, as a Canadian, a deep sense of shame that this cruel and senseless act should have been conceived in cold blood and executed in like manner. And I want to express to Mrs. Laporte and to Mr. Laporte's family the very deep regrets of the Canadian people, of the Canadian government, and our desire as Canadians to stick together in this very sorry moment of our history.
What could you tell us, Mr. Lammers, about the kind of people you're dealing with?
I can't tell you anything more.
Thank you, Mr. Lammers.
Sunday, October the 18th. A sermon is given by Laporte's old friend, the mayor of Montreal, Jean Drapeau.
Is it a warning addressed to all those who hold public office that they will not only be suppressed or assassinated, but that it will be done in the most cruel manner? If there is a lesson that we should accept, if there is a message, and I'm sure that this must have been the last thought of Pierre Laporte, it is that his sacrifice should not have been consented in vain. That all men holding public office should have the courage to continue.
Those responsible for this crime will be found and will be dealt with in the calm and dispassionate atmosphere of Canadian courts. The FLQ has sown the seeds of its own destruction. It has revealed that it has no mandate but terror, no policies but violence, and no solutions but murder.
If you could emphasize that part of it for us, that we're not making a point. It's not a time for Quebecers.
Well, I'll follow your questions. And maybe I can
what I'd
fill
rather
it
you
in.
did.
No, I'll do it myself if I can.
Do a 60 for me.
How long do you want to?
I want a 60 seconds.
No, honestly, I can't do that. No.
How long?
Well, I don't know, but if you want 60 seconds, get it from somebody else. I don't want airtime. I couldn't care less about goddamn airtime.
No, it's not airtime.
But I'm not going to distort things.
No, don't distort.
The hell with that.
Okay, all right.
This thing is... No.
No, we'll do it your way.
This thing is Look, God damn it, we're not a soap opera.
I know
and
that.
We're not a soap advertisement. If you want
This
that,
way,
get
no.
it somewhere else.
No, well, we're not looking for that. You know.
Well, you are
ready,
with
Bob?
60 seconds.
Well,
The guy dies. Our opinion, oh shit.
yeah, go ahead. Okay, you running? Could you express your view and that which you have expressed already today for us, please?
Yes. Well, basically, speaking for the Parti Québécois, but also in conjunction with people from the unions, the CNTU, the FTQ, and the Teachers Union, and also with individuals like Mr. Claude Ryan of Le Devoir and others. We agreed on some basic positions. First of all, that, as everybody knows, we find something completely intolerable in Mr. Laporte's barbaric execution by people who have no sense of humanity, who don't reflect Quebec. We have our share of terrorists, active or potential, as every civilized society has, but they don't reflect Quebec. If they did really reflect anything valid in Quebec, I'd get away from here so fast I would never come back. On the other hand, there's also this fact that the government in Quebec and in Ottawa have been using this hard line of la raison d'etat, you know, the decision of not negotiating. They have a share of responsibility. They've already ended up with the death of one of the two hostages. So we hope to God, and we repeat it, we said it a few times before in the groups that we form, and we have nothing political in this. I don't know if anybody wins or loses in this damn thing. I know everybody loses something. We just want to insist again that this line, this rigid line, we think was wrong. We know they believed in Ottawa when they dictated it, that it was right, but I think they've proved now, at least they should have proved that it, from a human point of view, from something very much more essential than just clamping down, they were wrong. So we hope to God that they'll reconsider if need be, and they'll think more now than anything else about saving the one man, Mr. Cross, who apparently is still alive. And again, we ask, with no illusions now, but anyway, that if there's any sense of honor left or can be revived in the guys that were the kidnappers, that for the love of God, they give up. There's no illogic. This is not illogical. The only consistent, clear thing in our attitude over the last few days has been that governments and, at the other end, the extremists find some common ground to save human lives. And whatever happens, we also insist that Quebec, on account of this, there is a blot on Quebec. We all share it. We have to get rid of it. We have to deplore what happened. But on the other hand, let no one think, wherever he is, outside Quebec or inside Quebec, that this is enough to make us a sort of cell, a collective cell of repression. We'll fight, if we have to, against anyone who wants to use this climate now to more or less, you know, tie up Quebec in impotence. We're still going to develop, and we hope we take a lesson out of this that makes our society more aware of the price of human life and of making it livable. But that's our responsibility, and no one should think this is an excuse to make Quebec a jail.
It is still not known what happened during Laporte's last week. Now Laporte is dead, and the carefully guarded young Premier Bourassa, the other powers, and the public in huge numbers come to pay their last respects to the second most powerful politician in Quebec. Monday, October the 19th. The mysterious house where Laporte was held by the Chenier cell of the FLQ. The window through which he apparently tried to escape. The garage which must have concealed Laporte's arrival. The room where Laporte is supposed to have been killed. Are found by the police. 2 days too late. Laporte's funeral is held on Tuesday, October the 20th. The church of Notre Dame is surrounded by hundreds of well-armed soldiers. Madame Laporte had asked for a simple funeral, but the ceremony becomes a state occasion. Watched by huge crowds, the powerful show their support for the government. Pierre Laporte came close to being the Prime Minister of Quebec. He was the most experienced minister in Bourassa's cabinet. He had been a minister in Lesage's cabinet during La Révolution Tranquille. He had had a long public career in both journalism and politics. He was 49 years old when he died. Why exactly the kidnappers decided to proceed with the killing of Pierre Laporte may never be known. But one thing was clear, that the men in charge of Canada and Quebec were not going to let personal emotions interfere with the running of the country.
Cause of death: acute asphyxiation by strangulation by means of a bond. This bond could be a small chain which Mr. Laporte had around his neck and which was still in place at the time of the post-mortem. The marks traced of the strangulation was all around the neck, except at the back of the neck where it appeared that it had been twisted.
The Liberation Cell of the FLQ sends this photograph of Cross to prove that he is still alive. While the frantic searches continue, a new movement to save Cross's life gets underway. The three major trades unions in Quebec sympathize with the social aims of the FLQ and oppose the War Measures Act. They overcome their long-standing differences and band together, and both the union leaders and the leaders of the Parti Québécois urge the government to give in to the demands of the FLQ to save the life of James Richard Cross. But those in power hold fast as Montreal prepares for a municipal election, an election many felt should have been postponed. The atmosphere is one of confusion, fear, and distrust, which lends itself to the stampeding of frightened voters. Two opposition candidates are arrested under the War Measures Act, and both Mayor Drapeau and Jean Marchand claim, incorrectly, to have discovered a link between the FLQ and the only serious opposition facing Drapeau, FRAP.
When a movement invites that kind of speaker, and when all the members that are attending the meeting, 3,000 of them apparently, according to the papers, are shouting the letters FLQ, FLQ, I don't think that we need much more evidence to say that there is more than just a moral sympathy.
And when you give these kind of powers to local authorities, you no longer know what use or abuse they're going to make of those powers. This is what troubles us. And you've already had examples of it. You've had an example in the city of Vancouver where the mayor of that city says we can use these powers to clean out the hippies and the draft dodgers. You have a statement by the chief of police in one city on the prairies who said a lot of people that if you wanted to pick up, this would be a good time to do it. And now the growing suspicion, as pointed out by, for instance, Ron Haggart in the Toronto Telegram last night, that it looks very suspiciously like the regulations and these sweeping orders are going to be used in the province of Quebec. On the one hand, to clean out FRAP, which is opposing Mayor Drapeau, and then the other hand, to get rid of the separatists who have incurred, of course, the displeasure of both Mr. Choquette, the Attorney General, and Mr. Marchand.
No, we have no interest in the Montreal election. This is up to the citizens of Montreal to choose their councillors and their mayor, and we don't want to intervene at all in this.
But the fact is you have already intervened, sir, by what you said.
No, I didn't say that all members of the FRAP organization are members of the FLQ or anything of the kind. I just said that the FRAP has a body took a position which gave some kind of moral guarantee to the FLQ, that's all. But when I said that it was a front, I think it went too far, and this is the only thing I want to correct. As far as the rest is concerned, well, let's wait after the municipal election. And
what organization was going to create chaos in and around the Montreal election, bombings?
Well, these are the things that we're going to clarify, I hope, in a few days.
This is an attempt to stampede the voters by a smear tactic, guilt by association. You take an organization and you, without any advancing any proof, without producing any evidence, you damn it by aligning it in the public mind with an organization that has just been declared by order in council to be an illegal organization.
To no one's surprise, Drapeau wins easily, winning every one of the 52 seats.
Merci à ceux qui ont permis.
Thank you to all those who, with their votes, have prevented democracy from suffering yet another, even more serious blow. I also wish to thank all those in the provincial and federal governments who understood that our system of government, for which so many of our people gave their lives in battles overseas, was in danger here. And who came forward to help this regime resist not only the known revolutionary attacks, but also the attempts to constitute a provisional government which would preside over the change from constitutional power to revolutionary power.
Few people realized that Drapeau meant that there was a plot to overthrow the government of Quebec and replace it with a provisional government. Drapeau's far-fetched accusation is angrily denied by the prominent people implicated, including editor Claude Ryan, and the whole affair is buried by Bourassa.
I give you the reasons why I have to act to avoid more troubles. There is no question of provisional government being involved in my decision. I was told about that, about the possibility of such a thing, but I did not take that very seriously.
By now, the several police forces have managed to figure out the names of most of the kidnappers, and their descriptions and pictures are papered across Quebec. Bernard Lortie was the first Laporte suspect captured. Lortie was caught here on Queen Mary Road. But Paul and Jacques Rose and Francis Simard managed to escape by hiding in a cupboard behind a false wall while the police searched the apartment. As the weeks passed, a few people in English Canada finally began to protest the loss of civil liberties and to question the need for the War Measures Act.
It's a direct attack upon liberty. It's a direct attack upon freedom.
But the vast majority of the population continues to support the Prime Minister and his government's actions. The few people who do oppose the War Measures Act are far from popular.
And you with your publicity, oh, that's nothing to do.
Canada, land of freedom, freedom or force.
For the hundreds who are imprisoned here in Montreal's Parthenay jail, Canada is indeed a land of force. Montreal's original Thursday night request is defended by Drapeau.
The public order was very much in danger, and on that Thursday morning, we were really upset. And had it not been with the arrival of the army, the Canadian army, to reassure the population, and we know now how unanimous the population is about the presence here of our Canadian army, well, it would have been the open revolution.
Every country that has had its freedoms and liberties curtailed has been told in advance that this was being done for their protection and it was only on a temporary basis. My position has to be that unless I can get convincing evidence that the government is faced with an insurrection, then I am naturally not going to accede willingly to surrendering the basic freedoms of the people of this country.
The government fails to provide any more evidence, convincing or otherwise. Early in December, a trail of clues leads to northern Montreal. The soldiers throw a huge cordon around the suspected street, and the world knows that at last Cross has been located.
Go out there and move the kids back.
The Liberation Cell of the FLQ negotiates with the authorities, claiming that they are well armed and that they have a huge quantity of dynamite. After several nervous hours, the authorities agree to fly the kidnappers and their families to Cuba in exchange for the life of the man who has been held captive in this duplex, James Richard Cross.
We backed out into the street. Carbonell was so excited he scraped the side of the car against the wall and had to go back in again, come out again. And there we were out in the sunlight, which I now saw for the first time in 60 days. We then had the most terrifying ride through the streets of Montreal, surrounded by police, and I was really afraid we were going to have an accident because the door of the car wasn't very secure. Langto was trying to hang on to it, and I was trying to hang on to him because I was afraid if we had an accident and there was dynamite in the car, we'd all blow up.
Hidden by the newspapers are Cross, the negotiator, lawyer Mergler, and Langto, Carbonell, and Langlois of the FLQ. A tired but happy Cross waits in the Canadian pavilion, chatting with relieved politicians. This aeroplane has been ready since before Laporte was killed. Cross's kidnappers, some members of their families, and an old television set are flown to Cuba, and then Cross is freed. Marc Carbonell, Yves Langlois, Jacques Cosset-Trudel, and Jacques Langto are all now said to be living in Cuba, and James Richard Cross is reunited with his family in England. As the year of 1970 comes to a close, this house near Saint-Luc, 20 miles from Montreal, becomes the scene of the last drama. At the end of a tunnel in a cave were Paul and Jacques Rose and Francis Simard. Trapped by the police, they quickly gave themselves up, asking only that the people still detained under the War Measures Act be released on bail. Bernard Lorty, Francis Simard, Jacques Rose, and Paul Rose will battle with a legal system which, they claim, is imposed foreign and without jurisdiction in their country, Quebec. For Canada, the arrests, the kidnappings, the killing, and the removal of civil liberties have come as a sad and costly loss of innocence.